So the reason I'm speaking in English is because, I was told other papers were given in English, but also I wrote a paper of 20 pages about contextualizing the self, and then I was really unhappy with it because I thought it didn't have an actual self. I mean, it doesn't have a text that I actually have worked on really hard. So I started last Thursday writing a new paper, which will be divided into two parts, as you'll see. One of them is talking about possibly something we may call a self, and that's the self of Thomas of Monmouth, whom I'll introduce. And everything I do to him will then perhaps be interrogated or explained in the second half, which will, in a way, survey the various types of ideas, theories, concepts, influences that have brought me to sitting here and able to talk about him in that particular way. So we will start, and at this point, I'll ask Einat, who's my assistant for the day, to circulate the aforementioned Penguin Classic, but you'll see a picture of it in a minute. So I spent several years with a 12th century monk, Thomas of Monmouth. With the text that he wrote, the Vita et Passio Wilhelmino Vicensis, the life and death of William of Norwich. It is in the course of the project of translation and edition of that text, and hence I was literally deeply involved with him day in, day out, that I got to know this self. Literally, there was a daily portion, and it felt like a daily relationship. So I came to Thomas because the text he composed is of very great interest and of great horror, and for several reasons. It's the first narrative account that we possess, which provides both a narrative and an internal logic to the story of a child murder committed by Jews, that is, murder of a Christian child. It recounts the life of a boy of 12, William of Norwich, from its start and until his death at the age of 12 in 1144, which Thomas claimed to have been done by the Jews of Norwich. It's a text of hagiography, an account of the emergence of a cult, and through the description of illnesses and their cures, thanks to the boy martyr, it is also of interest to historians who study pilgrimage, who study medical issues. It has survived in this sole manuscript, which was discovered in 1891 and soon brought to the attention of a very eminent medievalist then in Cambridge, M.R. James. And James arranged for Cambridge University Library to purchase this unique manuscript. He identified it, and then he got them to purchase it. And there it is in the Cambridge University Library, where I was able to go and study it day in, day out. He also made his discovery known to an older, a retired cleric by the name of Augustus Jessup, who was an expert in local Norfolk history. And together they proceeded towards a project of publication that was realized in 1896. And that's the volume, that's the frontispiece of the volume. They wanted the text, they were really intent for the text to get out there quickly because they were anxious that they should be the first editors of this new find rather than those whom they called the Romanists, that is, papists, that is, Catholics. There's a lively correspondence between these two men, which has survived in part, and there were good letters, interesting letters, which I've studied, and thus traced their own progression through the editorial work, I suppose their own editorial selves. They were also both keen writers of ghost stories, though M.R. James was by far the more famous, and indeed there are now these sort of vintage reeditions, republications of his works that are very, very popular and pretty creepy. But anyone working on medieval manuscripts would enjoy reading them because medieval manuscripts are central to all these horrific, occult, and really spine-chilling stories. My own aim, though, was straightforward. It was just to translate and to make available this very rich and important text so it can be used in the classroom, so that there's enough of information for people who are just interested in the Middle Ages or in Jewish history or in a whole lot of topics, or in Norfolk indeed, to be able to read with ease. I offered an introduction and attempted to build a rich historical context, well, as rich as possible, for the decades in the third quarter of the 12th century when Thomas of Monmouth was at work. I was not much interested in him to start, really, but as I spent time with the text, I developed a greater interest. In my attempts to understand him better, all I had was really the information contained in his own text. There is nothing else surviving. And that text is substantial. It's 44,500 words in Latin. And it was written by him over 23 years, as I shall explain. I also, so in the work of building the context, I marshaled, and perhaps getting to know him better, I marshaled everything I could learn about the goings-on in the world of 12th century monasticism in Europe and in England, on monastic education, its regional qualities, the regional qualities of South Wales, because his name, Thomas of Monmouth, means that he came from Monmouth, from South Wales, and where there was a very distinctive Southern Welsh monastic culture. And of course, embedding all of this within Norwich and Norfolk, and I'll just remind you where they are. So on the left, you see East Anglia with Norfolk there, the county at the north. And Norwich is not on the sea, it's on the River Wensum, which falls into the sea, and you see it over there, I think, towards the right. And at the bottom right, you will see the structure of the city. And if you look at the map that's on the right, you will see three, sorry, I can't get up and show you, I'm supposed to sit and not move because of the filming. You see that there are three elements, three parts in that city. The middle one is the castle, the one to the left is the sort of new Norman settlement, and the one far to the right is the cathedral, which is also a new arrival. So all this is really the setting for understanding better the life, death, and afterlife of the boy William, and the lives of his admirers as well as his detractors, but also for the purpose of this encounter, I've thought much more about Thomas of Monmouth himself. So as mentioned, my work unfolded in dialogue with these Victorian, Edwardian, scholarly Anglican clergymen who first discovered and studied the text, and thus also Thomas himself. And they had really rather strong opinions about the author in that sense. They really thought they got to know him, and thus were able to judge him. Especially Jessup, who was charged with the translation, that was his part of this collaborative project. So he worked, like I did later, he worked daily with the text, and he was quite vociferous in his letters about what he thought about Thomas. In March 1894, he said, "It's a horrible long business, this, and this monumentensis," that's the genitive of the name, "is such a scoundrel." And he described him in a later letter, a few months later, a bit of a scoundrel, at any rate, half knave, half fool, and altogether a visionary. And it's interesting that they built up this head of steam of disapproval of Thomas, because it fits in very neatly with this attitude that the editors had, which is the way in which they absolutely distant themselves from these excesses of anti-Jewish feeling, which his text describes and expresses, because of course they were Protestants of the late 19th century, so that strange medieval world of, and they call it superstition and legend and so on, is of course nothing to do with them. So following the edition of 1896, this text wasn't much studied or used really, but it was out there. And it was really just rediscovered, as I hinted, in the 1970s, in the course of a sort of resurgence of a social history in general, and people writing about pilgrimage and writing about medicine. So they used to dip into this text in order to find great examples of illnesses and their cures, and obviously various habits along the pilgrimage routes of those who came to see the boy's tomb after he became the subject of a cult. And it's only in the 1980s that Thomas himself becomes a subject of interest and perhaps emerges as a self. And that is thanks to the work of a really rather wonderful medieval historian, Gavin Langmuir, who was a historian of Capetian France. And through various routes, he started writing about Jewish Christian subjects. And he wrote this article in Speculum called Thomas of Monmouth, Detector of Ritual Murder. And the word detector is used advisedly. That is, he really saw in him someone out there, to find the truth, interrogating. He tried in a rather whimsical way also to connect it to the genre of detective literature that's very English, and to say, was Thomas of Monmouth the first sort of in the line that gave us Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers and so on. But what is right about Langmuir is an excellent historian. The article is a very good one. And what he tries to show is that Thomas sort of found a reason for being, a project in life, through the work on excavating this case of a boy killed allegedly by the Jews, and yet the Jews weren't punished. The boy was left in 1144, just uncelebrated, unremembered as a martyr. There's no cult to him. And in 1150, when Thomas of Monmouth arrives in Norwich and joins the Norwich Cathedral Priory, this was all about to change. So before we delve into all of this, just a word about the text's structure and its textual environment. For these tell us, of course, about the importance and the orientation of its author. This Nachleben does as much as the text itself. So the life and passion of William of Norwich, which the writing of which began in 1150, is actually known to us in that manuscript that I showed you, which was copied out around 1200. And it exists in a manuscript that contains 8 parts. This is the one and the first in this collection. And all those texts are associated with new hagiographies of the 12th century. Not old ones, not known saints, but sort of new saints or new exemplary lives. And since it's the 12th century, you're not surprised that it also that it has a lot of people who were exemplary for simple living, various forms of poverty, and quite sort of modest people, modest in origins, that is, not great monks and bishops and like so many of the early medieval saints were. So it's not surprising also, therefore, since it's 12th century, that quite a few of these characters who are described in the other parts of the manuscript are in fact with some sort of Cistercian connection. And to remind those who aren't medievalists that the Cistercian order was created in the very last years of the 11th century, and it was one of the great success stories of the 12th century, really spreading as an order of hundreds and hundreds of houses throughout Europe. And with its distinctive style of austerity and poverty. But because it was an order, materials and news circulated very, very fast within it. So if you got into this Cistercian network, news about you would move around quite quickly and effectively. And that's exactly what happened to our story. Because the manuscript we have, the one copied around 1200, which you saw a minute ago, was in fact produced in a Cistercian house. That's one of the things I've been able to establish on paleographical grounds. So what I'm saying is that although Thomas of Monmouth was part of a sort of old-fashioned Benedictine cathedral priory in Norwich, in fact what he wrote received its reception most effectively in quite different circles, and those circles were also instrumental in getting the story of Jewish child murder, that is, child murder at the hands of Jews, to audiences on the continent, where indeed the story had much more of a sort of, had a much more eager and long-standing reception than in England. So like all 12th century writers, Thomas was schooled in classical rhetoric, and so he opens his writing with a prologue, which was also a dedication to the then Bishop of Norwich. And this prologue, all the hallmarks of the tradition, protestations of humility in the face of the task at hand, the claim that he was forced, he never really dared to write it, but he was forced by the other monks in the cathedral priory, and of course begging forgiveness in advance, since the work was bound to fail, to fall short of expectations and have all sorts of errors and mistakes. The prologue teaches us that Thomas was well schooled then in these Latin writing conventions, and that he was embedded in the monastic environment to which he was now a new arrival in 1150. Above all, he was keen to right a wrong, the killing of an innocent 12-year-old by the Jews, to make it known, to explain why it happened and how it happened, and indeed what needs to happen immediately, that is rectifying that and creating a cult for this deserving boy. But even his conventional prologue does more to establish Thomas's personality than those protestations would first suggest. What begins as a humble request for approval, indulgence, and acceptance of his failings in grammar and vocabulary moves on to a request that the merits of the boy martyr be extended to himself in his project. The martyr's virtues, which he was telling and which had been neglected so far, were reason enough to take him seriously, he said. Towards the end of the prologue, Thomas addresses the reader and even any future disparager or objector to his project directly and quite haughtily. And finally, full of purpose, he goes on to offer a summary of the work and an introduction to its structure and logic. So over the course of the prologue, his voice changes. Thomas emerges then as an author much in charge of his enterprise. And when he does cite authorities in support of his project, they are widely known and highly authoritative, nothing less than Horace and Virgil and Augustine and Jerome. He moves on then to Book 1, and here Thomas gets right down to hagiographical purpose, moving from classical prologue mode to the medieval hagiographical. Convention dictated that the circumstances of the saint's death and early childhood be told, and often there are intimations of the holiness even before their mother conceives, and so it was here indeed. He tells, and he does not yet explain how he knew these to be true, that the boy's mother had a prophetic dream. Oh, just the context of Norwich in which this is all happening, in this Norwich Cathedral Priory, very, very fine. Norman sort of begins as a Romanesque project, goes on to be realized as a fully Gothic one. And this is the page on which his birth is told. And soon after the boy's birth, he displays miraculous powers even as early as his weaning ceremony. All this is told in delicate detail with attention to family life, to the rural environment from which the boy hailed, and it's marked with invocations about the workings of God's will at every step. As the conscientious editor, here I inserted myself, offering details about William's birthplace. So, for example, I can tell you that this is the village of Havringland, where the boy was supposed to have been born, and a visit also showed that even until the 18th century, there were still remnants, physical remnants of relics that were associated with his early life, not relics of his body, but relics associated with the miracles that he worked even as a little boy and locally. I don't know if Thomas ever visited it, but I definitely did. The action next moves to the city of Norwich, to which the boy was sent at the age of 7 to learn the craft of leatherwork, to become indeed an apprentice skinner, moving from country home and its security to dangerous city. As a growing boy, William showed signs of devotion uncommon in a child of his age. Frequent fasting, quick learning of letters, and incessant prayer. He also had nimble fingers and was assiduous at his work as an emergent skinner. And here his fate meets that of the Jews, for we are told that he worked for them, that the Jews, because he was cheap, and Thomas admits, maybe because also he was nimble and good at his work, they hired him to mend their mantles and furs and cloaks that they received as surety against loans that they gave out. So enter the Jews and their knowledge of this boy, an absolutely crucial link for Thomas to establish in order for the story to progress to its more violent, imagined next stage. So when in 1144, through very complex machinations that were imagined as controlling the activities of a Europe-wide Jewish conspiracy to annually kill a Christian child, when in 1144 the lot fell upon the people of England to produce this enormity, and on the people of Norwich within England, there is already the background. The Jews of Norwich know about this pious boy. So as Lent develops and goes into Holy Week leading up to Easter, they have a plan. They send an emissary. They send someone pretending to offer the boy a good work during the days of these holy days, and to be a cook in the archdeacon's kitchen, and helping in the kitchen with all the food and the hubbub, one imagines. The boy was really attracted. Even this very pious boy, we are told, was really attracted to have the job. But, of course, for the holidays, you're expected to go home. And here we have the most extraordinary set piece, because this emissary and the boy William, Thomas tells us, had to go into the village to meet the boy's now widowed mother and to convince her to let the boy spend the holiday not with her, but in this type of rather promising employment, but far from her home. So, of course, mother does not agree. And they go there and they try to convince her, and she says no. And Thomas claims that she says no because she wants the boy at home, but she also says no because something in her entrails, something in her viscera, something inside her sort of tells her this is not right. And here we find Thomas really in his particularly inventive. So let us meet him as an author here for the first time. He tells a fable-like, extremely carefully patterned tug of war over the boy. Now the traitor, that's the emissary, then the mother. He begs, she refuses. He begs, but only to fail. She refuses, lest she may lose him. He claims to be the archdeacon's cook, but she does not believe at all. Between her and him, as between a sheep and a wolf, who first would you think the strongest in the fight over the third, that is the third in the middle? The lamb. The lamb was in the middle, the sheep on one side, the wolf on the other. The wolf stands in order to tear and devour. The sheep stands forth to rescue and save. And look at the brilliant constructions of these sentences with their two sides and the boy. She does ultimately get convinced. But just to show you that to talk about sheep and wolves and lambs is not nothing in this society. There's a tremendous obsession, of course, with, you get this in Bestiaries quite a lot, the description. So he takes something, and we have, this is not I thought to start it might be a classical fable, but it isn't. But he develops it in this particular way, very dramatically. Ultimately, though, the mother, through her fickleness and being paid 3, not 30 coins of silver, she lets the boy go. So here we see the movement of Thomas into something creative, unexpected. You have a sense that he is moving into a different register from the earlier reporting in the hagiographical mode. With the boy in place then, situated now, as he's not taken, of course, to any archdeacon's kitchen, he's taken to the house of a leading Jew, Eleazar, Thomas's most creative moment arrives, an even more creative moment than the one we just saw. Because here is the first telling of the intentional killing of a Christian boy by Jews, and its model is no less than Christ's crucifixion itself. Torment we have here, pricking with sharp objects, and finally hanging unto death, all done by cruel, mocking, shaming protagonists. For all the biblical echoes, it is a true moment of invention. The form of torture as well, which is used and which we'll read in a minute, the form of torture that Thomas of Monmouth chooses in order to show how cruel were the Jews towards the boy, is rather unheard of, and I'd only be absolutely delighted if somebody in this room knew something about it. It's torture by rope, by knotted rope, you will see in a minute, onto the now shaven head of the boy. of course, in patterns of 5 as well, invoking Christ's wounds. They concentrate on the pain, especially around the head area, exactly like in the imagining of the Christian story. So here Thomas really gets into full flow. And this is where he has nothing to build on at all. Bits and pieces, of course, of thinking about the crucifixion and thinking about Jews, but this is a new story. For some of them held him, the boy, from behind. Others inserted into his open mouth a torture instrument known in English as a teasel. It's a sort of metal object used in textile preparation. And they fixed it with straps either side of the jaws to the back of the neck, where they made a very tight knot. Next, they took a short rope, about as thick as a little finger, and made 3 knots in places marked on it, and encircled the innocent head from forehead to the back. In the center of the forehead, they pressed a knot, as they did on each temple. Both sides of the head were tied to the back extremely tightly, and there a firm knot was made. The ends of the ropes were tied around the neck and around under the chin, and there this unheard of type of torture was completed in a 5th knot. Thomas is also compelled to address the question which would have been on the minds of at least some of the readers and hearers of his work. How did he know all of this in 1150 when it all happened in 1144, in Holy Week 1144? After telling of the boy's death, Thomas explains he had conducted investigations, like a detective with a cold case. He visited the site, the very house. He found the door between whose posts the boy had been hung, even traces made by the chains that had bound him. He continues in creative mode with no guidance. It's not. I'm sorry.
No, you're okay. Maybe I can hear you a little better.
Okay, thank you. He continued in creative mode with no guidance from previous tales, hence particularly inventive. In the next chapter, where he imagines a debate between the Jews after having killed the boy, what do we now do with the body? And I encourage you at some point to read the text. It's a very, very interesting discussion. He's hearing Jewish voices trying to imagine how Jews conduct their consultations. Ultimately, they decide to go out of the town, out of the city, and into the wood, and to bury the boy there. This is the area where they buried it. I mean, it's now quite nicely landscaped, but this is where it was, Mousehold Heath. And we're also told that, unluckily for the Jews, there was a witness. The treatment of that witness reveals Thomas's underlying position on the Jews and their protectors, and we may call this a political position. For like many other writers about Jews and their alleged crimes, Thomas associated Jews with the power and protection of kings and their servants. So it is with the Sheriff of Norwich, who is portrayed as a bribed protector of the Jews and an agent of their arch-patron, the King of England. Even in 1144, which is in the middle of a civil war in England, the sheriff is a crucial figure in the story. And that sheriff coerces the witness who saw the burial in the wood never to speak, to keep silent, until that man's deathbed confession to a priest many years later, information that is brought to Thomas and adds to the unfolding and strengthening of his case against the Jews. So after the feat of inventing the killing of a child by Jews, the creation of a new and powerful tale about Jewish action against a Christian child, Thomas moves on to another mode of telling. After the boy's death, which he had to recreate and invent, he moves to telling events which he might have heard as part of the sort of local public knowledge that was circulating in Norwich around Easter time, once the boy's body was found, because the boy's body was found on Monday after Easter, and that put into motion, we are told, a whole lot of actions, particularly the family of the boy, who claimed that from looking at the body, they could see that he had been killed. It was no ordinary death, it was no accident, he was killed by the Jews. And moreover, the signs of special lights and miraculous emanations around the body in the way of fantastic smells and so on also confirmed this was no ordinary death, this was a particularly meritorious one, and that the Jews were the guilty party. So what we have in the next stage in the telling is Thomas perhaps recounting rumors about this story that were still alive in Norwich when he arrived there in 1150. So it's not hagiography, it's not creativity, it's more a bit like journalism, sort of people telling you stuff and you're trying to piece it sort of together. And indeed, the family approached the bishop with their claim about what had been done to the member of to their son or to their nephew, and the bishop did the right thing. The bishop summoned the sheriff, and the sheriff says, "Look, there's no evidence. I mean, this is ridiculous." And he took them in for protection in the castle of Norwich, which is now a heritage centre, but for many, many years was a prison. So the book ends then with the burial of the boy, not with great pomp as the family had hoped for, but with some degree of attention. The Bishop of Norwich allowed them to bury the boy in the monks' cemetery, which you'll see is to the right, and that is the south of the chancel, that's the top of this map here, as you look at it. So Thomas of Monmouth is able to end his book one with the boy's burial and with an intimation of what's to come, because a rose planted at the foot of the tomb bloomed miraculously even during storms and well into the winter. So we get here a sense of what's coming, the vindication of the story. And that is indeed the subject of his book two as he moves to it. Thomas moves into a quite different mode yet again. Because if he was reporting and doing reportage towards the end of book one, and he ends it with a story, which he says, of the blooming rose, that must convince anyone who's doubtful, surely cannot remain doubtful about the boy's merits once they hear about the blooming rose. In book two, he truly takes on all those who might doubt or disparage his narrative. So he's really in polemical mode now in book two. And he also turned to the whole Christian universe in his explanations. He explains, he imagines detractors who might say, but it's all very well, but he's only a local little boy from Norwich. Nobody's heard of him in Greece or in Palestine. And he says, and do you really think that St. Cuthbert of Durham is known in Palestine or Greece? So what I mean to say is he's taking on more. It's become now an issue of establishing to the Church Universal that there's something very serious going on here. And it's a powerful book of polemic and invective. Again, Thomas, in yet another one of his rhetorical moods, perhaps one of his selves. Here Thomas then is moving from narration to polemic very effectively. And he continues emphasizing the fact that there is a Jewish plan. It is indeed in this book too that he also recounts the full conspiracy, that every year in Narbonne the heads of the Jews get together and throw a dice or decide which country, as I mentioned, will do the deed. So this is where he's explaining it. So he's definitely extended his extent and his vision from little Norwich and maybe the wood outside it into the Christian world, the economy, the whole Christian world. So now that his case is made, as it were, the boy's virtues are being vindicated increasingly by God, and Thomas has to move now and establish the cult in Norwich Cathedral Priory, his now new home. So book 3 sees action as he acts in that cathedral priory that I showed you before, and we can just imagine him. I thought I had them. Oh well, you remember what it looks like. It's very beautiful, and we have that sort of typical cloister going on, and we can just imagine him sort of swishing through in his black habit, sort of rushing about the place, giving people instructions. Very busy. He's a man with a mission. He's an administrator. He tells a great deal about. He organizes the transfer of the boy's body from the tomb outside the cathedral, into the cathedral. He gets workers, he gets stonemasons, he organizes it, and when the first burial place is too small to contain all the pilgrims, he sees to it that it's moving on. So in this book 3, he's very much a man making the cult happen. It sees him clashing, therefore, because he's innovating so much in this institution, it sees him clashing with authority, but also building up his own authority. He did everything he could to make the cult work. He placed a lovely cloth upon the tomb of the boy and special lights around it, only to see them removed by the prior of Norwich Cathedral Priory, who disapproved of these innovations and who became an inveterate enemy of our Thomas. Was obviously Thomas's superior. Every aspect of liturgy and devotional practice in a monastery was, of course, planned, budgeted for, accounted for in terms of resources and time. So Thomas's initiatives and innovations were frowned upon. But he was vindicated by supportive visions that proved him right, again and again, by the flow of miracles. No longer detective, then, Thomas is now promoter of the boy martyr. He's partisan and determined. His own reputation now depends on the cult's fortunes. He steals relics, he hides the boy's teeth to keep them for himself. He hides the best bits of wax offered to the cathedral priory for choice candles on the boy's feast day. He curries favor with prominent individuals interested in the cult. He made it all happen. Indeed, he starts calling himself, referring to himself as the boy's secretarius, and the mere word secretary doesn't quite convey the fullness of that term, which is also something about the keeper of secrets, you know, the person very much in the know about all of this. And he was clearly the go-to man in everything that pertained to the growing cult of William of Norwich, be it signs of cures, directions for practice. He may even have been involved in the creation of the liturgy for the boys' feast day in March, which is which is known to us only from this 13th century liturgical manuscript from the priory, obviously later, but it's very possible, because so was the custom, that actually the lections, the readings for the boys' feast day, different century, were actually taken sections from the text that Thomas wrote. The last 4 books then, 4, 5, 6, 7, were written over a period of some 20 years in stops and starts. They describe over 100 miracles of cure and transformation worked by the boy martyr's tomb, at his tomb, or by appeal to him from a distance through prayer. Most of the beneficiaries were modest men and women, and many children, from villages close to Norwich. Indeed, many of them were inhabitants of the manors that were owned by Norwich Cathedral Priory, hence the contact in terms of communication and information. The exciting, contentious, creative, inventive, and for a while quite successful stage of Thomas's life and work, a stage we may call charismatic, now ceded to, in these chapters 4 to 7, to the routine of a minor cult in the provinces, one soon eclipsed by the arrival in 1170 to Norwich Cathedral Priory of a much more promising and prominent relic cult, that of the Holy Blood. There are some hints of Thomas's mood in these sections, these later sections. The dated miracles indicate that there were real gaps between his reporting and his writing, between miracles and the happening of miracles to report. Several accounts open plangently by him as he complains, regretting the loss of interest in William's cult and the danger that William's name might be altogether forgotten. Yet all this was averted for a while with the occurrence of every new feast, every new wonder which he reports. Another new feature in this later part of his work is that the cult receives some sort of modest renommée in England and abroad. So we find that William knowledge is created not just by and around Thomas himself, Secretarius, but also in other places where news of William has reached, or where a text about William has reached. And it took place there, but people were often quite conscientious about reporting to this sort of home station, the mother the mother lode, as it were, and that's how Thomas gets news about these new occurrences in the cult of William. 1173 marks the last of these miracles, the end of Thomas's work, perhaps of his life, and definitely the last chance for us to glimpse into his self. So I began, as I explained, with a figure that none of you need to think about again after today, but it's a good testing ground, I think, for the type of reflections which underpin my coming here and my talking to you. That is, thoughts which, and I'm very grateful to the fact that I had the opportunity to think them through. For we humanities scholars confront the issue of the self often, almost unceasingly, and we should be grateful for occasions to think about it collectively in focused conversation. So I hope I'm right in saying that for most of the 20th century, the most interesting approaches to people in the past, to studying people in the past, emerge within methodologies that in fact put the person within the context of great collectivities, and be it the sociology of Durkheim or the psychoanalysis of Freud, and through the anthropologies of Geertz or the linguistic textualities of Derrida, and definitely the social vision of Foucault. The search for the self is always, and what historians have taken from it, has been an essentially, dare I say, social search within class, within community, within traditions, caught up in webs of language, or even in structures of the psyche. Anyone who has followed these conversations has confronted the dilemmas of self and society, individual and collectivity, structure, event, and change. We wonder, how does one account for cultural embeddedness on the one hand, and yet our ability to communicate and understand each other given the radical existential separateness of each and every one of us. The hegemony of communitarian and collectivist ideologies then, alongside materialist ones for most of the last century, vied with disciplines that favored a more liberal individualist type of emphasis, areas of the law, areas of philosophy, and economics, especially towards the end of that century. It is at the meeting of history and philosophy that an historical approach to individual thought and action, which is, I think, still going strong. I mean, he is definitely my colleague across the corridor and still going strong. And that is in the work thought through by Quentin Skinner from his Cambridge days in the 1960s and until now. As many of you know, Skinner studied political thinkers, notably Machiavelli, Hobbes, more recently Shakespeare, and distinctively through a method of intense contextualization. That is, although a linear tradition of reading of a canon of texts of political thought can be marked out from antiquity to any point since, a meaningfully historical engagement with the texts of political thought, he suggested, can occur only through the understanding of the immediate context of their production. Skinner's approach to individuals who wrote in the past is premised on deep linguistic and conceptual contextualization. That is to say, with a writer, say, like Machiavelli, he would attend very carefully not only to the texts that he read, not only to the texts that were produced in Florence in his day, but very carefully indeed to the use of terms like tyranny or fear or virtue, which must be understood through the meanings of those terms in Florence in his time. And if we are lucky, we might discern the ways in which he perhaps inflected them in new and important ways. How is this to do then with the self, this hyper-contextualization? Well, it is only that Skinner would claim that against such highly structured situations, linguistic, social, and political, that an author can truly be encountered, that his, and he deals really always with male writers, that's beginning to change now in the history of political thought, but it's still very, very inflected in that way, that his intention and creativity of that writer on political thought, the self, can be seen in action, actually in moments of emergence, of intent, creativity or innovation or elocution that arise from this deeply contextualized setting. And here Skinner, of course, borrowed from philosopher Austin the term of speech act. Skinner believed, indeed believes, that he can discern that moment of unique choice. He is not, he's quite happy to use the word intention of moral action that allows the individual to emerge as an agent. The hypercontextualization is the necessary setting of the scene, and it's tremendous scholarly labor, definitely in the way that Skinner does it himself, from which emerges perhaps that voice, the conscience, the self. Now, it occurred to me only in preparing this that, or rather, just another word about Skinner, and then I'll move on to the other point. So, attention to language led Skinner to a deep consideration of rhetorical traditions and strategies of argument in creative writing, again, navigating the waters between linguistics and textual rules, and personal elocution, what other call formidably langue en parole, to the textual structures that determine the possibilities of action, writing, saying, resisting, we should also add intertextuality, the ways in which any form of writing, and as we've already seen this in Thomas of Monmouth himself, any type of writing invokes, exploits, mimics, glosses, and recites others. And just as an aside, I find very helpful, although my attempts to make this a current term of usage have utterly failed, I, in my mind, like thinking of intervisuality as well, as the sort of images invoke each other in ways that texts do as well. Yet Skinner seeks to keep in balance the intention, and social historians will call it agency, of the author as against all these determining possibilities. And he does so by discerning acts of creativity, subtle changes in usage, even innovation in the use of inherited concepts by his chosen writers. Now, it strikes me that just a little bit after him, not much after, just even less than a decade, the late 60s and early 70s, another innovative scholar was occupied with context, though his name is not often combined with that of Skinner, and that is Stephen Greenblatt. His new historicism was announced in 1982 as a term, but really for a decade or so before, he was already seeking to break with the formalist procedures that govern the reading of literary texts, and of course, Shakespeare was his big thing. Formalists see poetry as belonging to a universal realm of human creativity floating in an atemporal space to be understood as relating to other great works more than it did to the mundane city streets or village lanes in the places they were composed. Greenblatt insisted on the utter permeability between history and the literary. He sought to contextualize by reading Shakespeare's plays, for example, against other contemporary texts of the period, which seemed to exist in affinity. These could be religious tracts, sermons on marriage, writings on magic. It was a capacious array of readings that he did and that he suggested, which gave a great deal of social grounding and allowed issues of class and gender and later race to be apprehended as part of the making of poetry, even beyond the poet's intention. It was a claim that poetry is poetry, but it is not just poetry. Compared to Skinner, the link between context to the way Greenblatt did context was definitely looser, less systematic perhaps, but I think that they were thinking really in parallel here, and it's worth noting that. Now, this commitment that Greenblatt was expounding to expand the social context of poetry was, of course, and to make that serve any analytical approach to any work, existed in parallel, of course, with the practices of the emergent, then new social history. Social historians made their ethical commitment to past humanity very clear. They sought to give voice, to tell the histories of those hitherto hidden from history. Many of the achievements of social history rely on the use of abundant, serial, and administrative or even judicial sources. inquisitorial records, tax lists, depositions delivered in courts. All these have offered the basis for some of the great classics of the later 20th century history. The power of the method was derived from its accumulation, its repetition, its serial quantity, which of course, to call it serial was of course already done by the historians of the Annales school in the 1960s. And this approach has enjoyed an extraordinary rebirth. I don't know if any of you, I'm sure some of you actually have noticed that in recent years, the last decade or so, because of the possibilities of digitization, the abundance of sources that are available to scan very, very easily and to ask these questions over time. Like, for example, the sole website of the Old Bailey records online has just in itself been a force for regeneration of social history, early modern social history, in a quite extraordinary manner. If you can judge it, you can see it in PhDs, you could see it in conferences and so on. So these types of sources allowed historians to ask new and exciting, even intimate questions about people in the past. It offered not detailed personal biographies on the whole, so much as a chance to glimpse a face, a self perhaps, in a crowd. A great example of such work, and it's just the most tremendous pleasure to mention him here, is the work of Tzvi Razi. Razi and his associates in Birmingham, and those like them, developed a methodology for the study of peasant communities in medieval England. They exploited the records generated by medieval landlords through the works of their stewards and reeves on the estates who managed them, accounting for agricultural routines of sowing and harvesting for the labor of unfree people, and thus, and also for labor that they hired for money. They did so through the regular court that they held every few weeks or monthly, and in which the rights of the lord were enforced, and they took records. And since serfs and free tenants were obliged to make specific payments at moments in the life cycle, like at marriage, like to get permission for marriage, like at death in order to inherit, these are actually sources that yield a great deal to the keen demographic eye. So we started to learn some of the most intimate facts about peasants in the Middle Ages. You know, their age at marriage, their average age at marriage, their average size of family, their life expectancies, their comings and goings, how many of them left to cities or not. All things very much worth knowing, essential characteristics of a society, yet without providing really that element of subjectivity. And when it was imagined, it also wasn't actually terribly convincing. Very rarely so. Occasionally, Tzvi used to think that he found a particularly sort of aggressive and resistant peasant, somebody who turned up in court quite a lot. It could just be a person with a problem with alcohol. I mean, you know, but so let's leave away the ability of judging intent. But these are really powerful and, as I say, intimate information to know about people in the past. And we have a sort of parallel from the urban environment in the famous workings on a big tax return from Florence in 1427, which revealed, again, things we did not know, that very often women were heads of households, but moreover, that single women were in abundance in these cities, and that women joined together and became roommates as they worked in order to share resources and perhaps to share sociability and feeling and emotion. So this is important. I mean, all of this is just so utterly important for understanding past lives. But it is a picture that arises through aggregation. Yet it is there for us to exploit as we go about the work of context making, which is, say, as Greenblatt understood it. It was the discomfort, though, indeed the dissatisfaction, with such seeming limitations of social history and its procedures that inspired a more interpretative approach to history in the past, one informed perhaps less by sociology than by anthropology, one we might then call the new cultural history. Its practitioners sought to discover what those who worked and traveled and nurtured, you know, the vast majority of people in the past might have experienced, their feelings, their ideas about the world, about God, about family, about community, through a radical extension of the sources of knowledge beyond the quantifiable and the aggregate. The premise was that the miller and the peasant woman had lives as rich and as interesting as any literate and educated individual. The expansion of sources meant a greater preoccupation with the visual and the material. What one art historian, Jeffrey Hamburger, described, we look now at the ugly, at vernacular writings, at vernacular art. Cultural historians discerned creativity and appropriation by those previously considered to be mere recipients of culture, religion, politics. And this move coincided with the vast strides of the history of women and gender, so it has given us a large number of studies of women, indeed, often emergent from their own authored texts. Now, religious writings, a sort of thing that Aviad and I and several other people in this room are interested in, offered a particularly rich terrain. Some individuals inhabited this world with a particular vivacity, let us say, and they are the ones who have often left us sources for study. And just some of these studies of single authors we can think of the study of Hildegard of Bingen here, the studies of Marjorie Kemp, and we have emergent experts on Marjorie Kemp in the room as well, or of Mechtild of Magdeburg, Catherine of Siena, so many others. And it's a certain type of operation that became very common in the 1990s, these types of deep explorations of an author through an authored religious text. Yet even as these projects celebrated the possibility of voice was the dominant term when it came to the exciting work of discovering a woman from the past, finding a medieval woman, not a queen, and listening to her ideas about religion, getting to know herself as she expressed intimate experiences, often in intimate detail about her body and her feelings. All of this was, of course, very interesting and good. But as such studies attempted to get to know the author through the text, they also offered context about the sort of context that the social history reveals, about their families they came from, the expectations of marriage, which they rejected, and the workings of the production of texts. So cultural historians became very, very clever in discerning the trails of the production of texts, of the dissemination of texts, of how texts came to be what they are. And, of course, therefore also aware of intertextuality. And Aviad Kleinbill's first book, Prophets in Their Own Country of 1992, attended to the ways in which such authors' writings and the memories of them were often co-produced with confessors and religious guides, and definitely edited and made available to the world thanks to the efforts of others. So, where is the author in all of this? Where is the self? In the very same year, Anne L. Clark, that is 1992, published her own book on Elizabeth of Schönau, a 12th century German nun who has left us her visions, fervent, engaged with their political and religious context. Clark was one of the first in such studies to consider seriously the role of Elizabeth, of the person who wrote them down, but who is kin, in this case a brother, Eckhard, who chose to forego what would have been for him a great high career in the church in order to stay in Schönau and to be his sister's secretary, to be her sister's promoter. Where does Elizabeth end and Eckhard begin? Now, this might seem a very easy question to ask now, but in the 90s it wasn't an easy question to ask, because so great an attachment and celebration was there of the delight of finding a female voice. Anything that seemed to detract from its authenticity, it wasn't a popular move. I think Anne Clark did it rather well. The relationship between author and the textual environment they lived and operated takes us back somewhat to the problems of context and intention, which so animated Skinner. The early 15th century mystic Marjorie Kemp, mother of 14, Brewster and businesswoman, and many-time pilgrim, is the author of what is claimed to be the first autobiography in the English language. She dictated her experiences, first to her son, then to a priest, over years. The text is modulated in various tones, including visions and polemic and travelogue. But she also sought to lose herself in texts that had been read to her, to lose herself, say, in the examples that she learned from an active saint in the world like Elizabeth of Hungary, and her charitable impulses, or the mystical texts of English writers like Hilton or Rolla. Marjorie Kemp's text was long in the making, just as was that of Thomas of Monmouth, and it recounted episodes of a lifetime, each in the generic frame that suited it. This ability to move between experiences, mother, pilgrim, suspected heretic, abject sinner, brings us to the usefulness of a temporal dimension in our exploration of selves in the past. We have seen Thomas of Monmouth, too, inhabiting various roles through his text over his writing life. Out of such reflections on the personas of a given author, the self emerges as a site of multiple identifications, a cluster of identities, aspects of which are assumed or enhanced according to context and according to the operation of powerful institutions and discourses. In very more recent years, and coming out of the fertile field of political and activist circles of American women, feminists of color, we consider intersection, that is, intersectionality is not a very elegant word, as a different form, as a way of thinking of the self as being produced and affected by a whole series of powerful operations, and race, gender, class, sexual orientation, but very, very strongly tied to those institutions that operate them, and always in embodied selves. The result is not so much performed identity, which has been the sort of direction that Judith Butler has pointed us to, but rather lives and life worlds produced through law, through labor, through policing, coexisting, overlapping operations of power on the soul, enduring body, self. The work of historical analysis here is one which identifies the convergence of these forces in a particular historical institution, say slavery at a particular time, or monasticism in a particular time, and the glimpses they offer of moments of intent action, creativity, and even resistance. And here we end. But how apt remains Marx's dictum at the beginning of the 18th Brumaire. Men make their own history. I'm quoting from him, so it's men. But they do not make it just as they please. Such a familiar text. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given, and transmitted from the past. And I would add that they do so with some elements of intention, but also with a great deal that they do not fully understand about themselves, and which sometimes we, yes we, those thinking historically, can understand better than they ever did. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. Questions?
Is there coffee somewhere? I mean, is there a source of coffee that's not too far away in that corridor over there?
There is a source of coffee. I need a volunteer. Okay.
I have so many girlfriends here I can ask. Oh.
In our common room, we have to go down.
Oh, not in that corridor. No, then leave it. I'm sticking to water. No, I thought it was literally just around the corner. I'm sorry. I just want to be alert, that's all. Yeah, okay. אל תדאגו, ממש לא.
Okay. Yes, please.
תודה, ממי. Okay.
The medievalists are rushing to
few minutes to think.
Why don't I begin then? So you started with Thomas, and then you gave us this wonderful survey of how contemporary historians deal with the self, or deal with the problem of the individual within context. What changed in your concept of Thomas from? I mean, you knew about him, I assume, but then you spent a lot of time on him. What changed?
I mean, I knew him, but quite frankly, as I suggested, even just preparing this made me think of him in a different way. So I suppose what one of my takeaways is this issue of evolution of the writerly self within a text. And I don't mean evolution in any sort of progressive way. I mean just the way change occurs and how that is embedded in institutions. That is to say, that one that text which he wrote, even its different books, do different work because his own situation in the world. First, it's a newcomer, then it's a guy who's fighting with institutions, trying to establish something, then it's a guy who operates a certain charisma in the field, then it's a guy who's maybe sitting around and saying, did my project work at all, you know? So I noticed that much more sharply once, thanks to you, I was actually thinking of him as a self. And what was really interesting to me was that dealing, you know, I didn't deal today with the child murder accusation, not really, only in the very minimum that was necessary. But it showed me also.
Did we actually got it?
Sorry? But yes. No, it's really interesting because while I was doing that edition, I had a sense of mission almost. I had a sense of purpose. I said, this is an important text to get right. It's important that in the classroom, this can be taught, thank you to the, this could be taught responsibly with all the tools that's necessary. Most of my attention was to the product as a product in a history of thinking about Jewish-Christian relations, religious literary endowment, etc. And even though I spent all that time with him, as I said, 4 or 5 years with a monk, I never spent them so intensively until I spent them for you. And then, so the way I built it was to say this is all obviously autobiographical in terms of, I was trying to say, okay, look at what I'm noticing about him. How did my own formation get me here to be able to notice these sort of things? And I was thinking, what did I read? What did I think through? What gave me my tools? I suppose that's it. There's a whole lot that isn't there. I just, chose some of the ones along the way because I think they would be interesting. And I know it's a very diverse group of people. I thought it would be very diverse with people from different periods, different disciplines. So I thought, let's check out some names that people will have engaged with. But I think that's how. So of course, one might say I didn't do my job properly when I did my edition because I should have paid him more attention. But I did what I did.
Well, you talk about him as an impresario. Okay, so he's an impresario of William. And
he's an impresario in the sense that you showed your guys often to be impresarios. Yeah.
So he's an impresario in that sense. He wants to start a new cult, and he's talking about, and he's doing everything he can to help that. But being an impresario, a saint's impresario, is not new. This is actually quite old. What is new is being the inventor of a blood libel. What makes him do that?
It's not the blood libel yet, quite.
Well, okay.
It's the child murder thing. Yeah. I think it is institutionally embedded, and it does have to do with that moment of arrival. And it has even to do with that cathedral that I showed, which was a new arrival. Everything was about giving moment and gravitas to what are really young institutions and new arrivals. That is to say, this is a new monastery. This is a new cathedral. There was no cathedral in Norwich.
Well, they need a saint, but do they need...
They need something.
Yeah,
they need something.
The victim of ritual murder.
They have it. Now, that's what he's producing. That's what we must start with. That's our trace from the past. He did it, and he did it there. Now, again, the work of contextualization in a simply sort of plodding, absolutely fundamental way was really important, because what I found was that the first bishop, who was the builder of the cathedral, and who was very well connected at court, and who would have been around so that when he arrives in 1150, some of the monks would have known that bishop, would have heard him preach, would have, part of a very living tradition. He emphasized very powerfully, he brought to this cathedral a very strong Marian devotion, and often he expressed that Marian devotion through well-known and well-established tales about Mary and the Jews. There's a subset of them, which I'm sure you know about. So there was something going on in that cathedral that if you looked at the books of sermons of this very, very famous and well-established bishop, and who knows, maybe they were still told, because maybe the book of his sermons was still used, might have inspired something. The Jews were there. They were living in the city. We don't hear any news about any troubles with them or anything of the kind, but maybe we're missing stuff. We don't have that much documentation from that period, but usually if there's harm is done to Jews, we hear about it because it's to do with the crown. So it gets into the accounts of the sheriffs and compensation and all sorts. So I try gently to suggest that there is a textual, liturgical context in this cathedral that might have developed a sensibility to the harm that Jews do to the Virgin Mary, to Christians, the disrespect, etc. That could be there. Now, we are told by him that in 1150 he was but acting on what had already been the rumors established in 1144 that Jews had done it. But even if there were these rumors there, and it's perfectly possible, business problems with the Jews, bad neighborhood with the Jews, all of that could have inspired the family of William to claim. Even if that is so, he clearly goes somewhere very new with all of this. He takes it in a new direction. So all the traces that are there, I try to work with, and I give sensible hypotheses. And that's where the context of just getting to know the city really well, getting to know its economy, getting to know its rhythms, getting to know the liturgical, doing all that good, beautiful social history was sine qua non in order to ask questions that are more complicated, as you say, about creativity, about intention. I was talking with Shula Shachar about this. I visited her yesterday, and she says, she was really fierce about him. She was really fierce. He's disgusting. Isn't it awful to work on these people? And you must make it clear to them in the seminar, Miri, that of course you've written about this great detail about the ritual. You aren't ignoring it, by talking about all this self-business. She thought, Tachlis, I wasn't talking about what's really important, this horrible story. So I have, and you can report back. No, but what I'm saying is that putting that aside, but I can't put it aside because it's what he's done. And that's why I brought you some of the sense of the creativity around that story. That story is one of his great moments in terms of putting it together in a compelling way, using just the right amount from the gospel, just around these echoes, a lamb taken to the slaughter. There's a lot of it which I delineate, which is there. So it's a person who's going through life. I think this issue of the temporal is really important. The temporality in when we're dealing with these sort of people. If we have a text, we have to be attuned, I do think. I particularly feel strongly about that because I've just been reading sections of Lyndall Roper's quite extraordinary current work on Martin Luther. She's written his great biography, which is extraordinary. She's now actually concentrating more on him and the Jews specifically. And talk about a journey. So it's just this issue of if the self, as we know, its layers, its accumulations, it's so many images that are brought to bear upon this thing. But we don't, I think, sufficiently, and particularly when we're dealing with literary texts. Do we talk about the early Chaucer or the late Chaucer? I don't think so, but we should. I think Gadi raised his hand first, but yeah.
You handle this, yes.
Should I handle it, really?
Maybe.
Okay.
No.
Hi.
Hi. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for this really fascinating story. I have a little bit more theoretical question. You mentioned Quentin Skinner as, I suppose, one of your models.
Not really as a model, but somebody who is there and one can't ignore, yeah.
A powerful agent.
To consider, to take into consideration. Now, Skinner is an intellectual historian, and he's dealing with political philosophy, philosophical texts like Machiavelli, John Locke. And one of his innovations is creating those texts as speech acts and contextualizing them within other speech acts. Now, the text that you were analyzing, behind this text, there's another act or other sort of actions taken by this monk initiating the cult. Now, would you say, what is the relationship between this text, if you take it as a speech act, and the other actions? Are there also speech acts or other actions? I mean,
I must say, the reason I resisted when you said one of the models is because I find Quentin extremely, extremely interesting. And interestingly, because just he's ubiquitous across the corridor, and I see the PhD students and how they respond to him, etc. It's interesting. He has actually grown over time. I took him at that moment of inception, and I'm not forgetting what you're asking, with that whole preoccupation with Austin and the speech acts and so on. He's moved a great deal. He's become, in fact, where he, in terms of his context, for example, he started with what is purely textual environments. By the 80s, he was actually looking at the visual, which I think is really interesting, with his very important work, for example, on the frescoes in Siena, as a form of elocution in the field of political thought, the malgoverno, buon governo, malgoverno. Or, for example, when he analyzed the amazing frontispiece of Leviathan. So actually, he's moved in his own sense of what is the context in order to include it's very welcome to me, the issue of the visual as well. And I think you will find that he's attached to the idea of intention, and he uses less this issue of speech act. But I agree with you. I totally agree with you that there's a question here of a hierarchy. Do we have to give a hierarchy? What's a really important speech act? What's a sort of marginal speech act? That's why I don't find it terribly helpful. But what I do find helpful is the idea that every time you sit down, or Thomas of Monmouth sit down, however much embedded what you're doing is in tradition and in rhetorical positions and in everything that you bring to it, that something quite extraordinary can happen. And if we call that the self or not, in a way, I'm sort of not too fussed about that, but I like to take away this idea that we are not totally lost in the forest of words, that there are moments that even might not be intended, but are interesting for historians to discern in terms of human creativity, in terms of voice, that are very, very telling. I suppose that's where I am on that. There was somebody else, but thank you very much, Avnil.
Yeah, thanks, Miri. This is fascinating, and I'm still thinking about why should I be mending cloaks, given a surety, if I ever think that I have to give them back. So something interesting was going on there. But my question is about the second half of the talk. And it's about, I think, a different variant of social history. I thought that some of the best work in social history was not about aggregating, but coming to terms with the issue of disaggregating data. That is, rather than having some person or persona in the narrative text and looking for context, the real problem was how to do record linkage in Russell's term, or to use layers and layers of very heterogeneous serial sources in order to catch a glimpse of particular persons within those networks. And I thought that was the methodological.
I
Otherwise,
know.
at the beginning of the 60s, we all overhead that sort of statistics and have general trends, but I'm thinking even of Gabi Signori's wonderful work on particular streets in Basel, in which she works so hard in order to realize these are the same people with different names living in the same apartment. And this is how she discovers that a servant is taking up her mistress's name once as part of the gift exchange between generations. So if we go that way, we have different ways of reconstructing.
That's exactly the way.
And the other one is about looking at the different over-determinations until we catch a glimpse of something that is individually determined.
I'm totally with you in that. I'm absolutely with you on that. And bringing in stuff of different orders. And there are epistemological questions. You're dealing one, it's an inquisitorial record, a tax record, what. But I totally agree with you. It's a world. It's a moment of magic, which seems easy when you're telling it or when Natalie Davis tells it. But boy, is it hard to actually achieve. And also, it's rare to achieve. It's rare to achieve that sort of moment of combination. But I would have thought also that even there's some of the problems that beset this endless accumulation of context, a la even Skinner in his ordered way, or the Greenblatt thing, is this still is, the gaps that we don't know until we know, which are possible and open, and we should be open to be corrected. So when Gabi finds, the something, that crucial thing that she didn't notice because of who she is and what she is, and this isn't a personalized comment, or just it fell from the sky from some, unused part of an archive or something. It's that sense of the unfinishedness of it, and that it's process, and that our work in that sense is process. And in that sense, and what she knew what she was doing, because it's exactly that also the moment when we started bringing in much more regularly issues of space. I mean, like you did with those studies and everything goes into it, And of course now, and very welcome, the issue of sort of sound, which also connects with temporality. I think we're thickening, absolutely. But I must say, I really think there's a moment of poetry still in the thought, or I remember as a student how it moved me to think that for a peasant that had never been studied before, we can know something so important like, some sort of even aggregated. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Miri?
The way you describe Thomas, he has two selves. He's a doer. He's also a writer, and he was really successful in doing because he invents a cult. But I wonder about the author part. You were very enthusiastic about the way he writes, but there was only one sole manuscript that survived, so maybe he's not that successful in writing. He's that kind.
But surely we don't judge an author by the degree of dissemination of their manuscript. Some of our favorites, yes. Yeah, no.
So,
Lepois just declares that Yuval Noah Harari is the most important thinker of the 21st century.
Sorry?
Lepois just declared
Yes.
Yuval Noah Harari is the most important thinker of the 21st century. So numbers count for some people.
True.
Yes.
Yes, I really don't know what to say to that, except that I still marvel. Now, no, I know what I'm going to say. I'm going to say that given that I was his tutor in Oxford when he came as a very, very shy, 20-year-old, to do his very, very traditional
History.
de-fill on, I think it was spies in the wars in the 16th century or something, I can't even remember. And I tried to give him as much support as I could. Little did I still marvel. So you see, temporality really matters in terms of the institutional embeddedness and the discourses that affected him.
How true.
How true. But, yes.
it seems that maybe not that many more people were interested in what he has to offer in real life, rather than being interested in what he has to offer in writing.
Well, three things. One is that we have no way of knowing how many copies there were or to what extent there were in Norwich, because there was a big fire in 1272. So nothing remains. But yeah, I agree with you. He wasn't like, he wasn't Robert Grosseteste. But it's interesting that through the trails of the Cistercian order, which I mentioned, that he ends up in some peculiar places on the continent. In Chronicles, for example, the case of William of Norwich will be entered in a Universal Chronicle in 1144. Important thing to remember. Moreover, if we're going to the Nachleben, it's very interesting in the Catholic Reformation, in those great big, Jesuit compilations of martyrs and saints and whatnot. He has a usual place.
He's there.
He's there.
And you? Little you?
Sorry, Little Hugh. Yes, Little Hugh. No, you mean Hugh of Lincoln?
Yeah.
Yeah, as well.
Okay, so together both.
Yeah. And of course, it's all just totally basics, a year, a name, and things. So he goes into places like that. Now, I should also say that what I suggested towards the end of the section about Thomas, that in fact he sort of, in the later books, it's more episodic, he's more disappointed, he's more anxious, and also some of the knowledge about his stuff is created elsewhere. That's really interesting, because we get entries in chronicles in other parts of England about, just like it happened in Norwich, it happened to us, but it never is it as elaborated. I mean, the text is an extraordinary text. Now, the even more interesting aspect is that, well, first of all, that it circulated in this sort of Cistercian manuscript. It's interesting. But utterly fascinating is the fact, and you can just imagine the eureka moment when I was able to establish this, is that the manuscript that you saw was copied circa 1200 in a Cistercian house in East Anglia, that is just a few tens of miles away from Norwich. But it's a house that was founded at the death of that sheriff, that Jew-loving sheriff, for the expiation of his sins. All his property was used to create a Cistercian house. So it's an extraordinary way in which the man who defended the Jews really needed some major act of benefactions to work on his soul in purgatory, sort of thing. So there's that. But that's the aside. But also to say that it may have been used in the liturgy. But yeah, he's not a major. I mean, I must say that when the editor of Penguin said to me, "So what are you doing, Miri, blah, blah?" And I said, "Oh, I'm doing this text, won't interest you, blah." He says, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, it's just this text. It's interesting to me for personal reasons. I think it's fascinating historically, but it's not like Penguin classics." He says, "Oh, you won't like this, Einat." He said, "Oh, these days, we're more like, we publish texts of cultural significance, not just good literature. We publish Marjorie Kemp." So he saw the point that this will be interesting at all sorts of levels. But I agree with you, he's not an amazing writer, not at all. But he does move. I think there are more than one or two. There are quite a few, and this issue of over time sort of is helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
I can answer that.
But there's a question over there.
Question I've raised. Yeah. I think
We only get half an hour of discussion?
Well, you were supposed to finish 15 minutes earlier.
Really? Oh, I thought it was a sort of 50-minute sort of gig. Okay.
No, but I promised.
I'm sorry.
One last question, really. So a short question.
There's somebody over there who's been
Short
really
answer.
patient.
We can do both.
We can talk
So
later.
you can talk later. Okay. No, so you can talk during dinner.
Okay.
Last question.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to ask, you spoke a lot about how modern research kind of tries to conceive of medieval selves, and I was wondering if you could say something about how Thomas or his contemporaries may have conceived of themselves as individuals, people with inner lives, people with lived experience.
It's an amazing, it's
Quick answer,
very
because
quick.
we have to-
It's an amazing period for this. Okay, bullet points. The 12th century is probably the most interesting moment in terms of reflection on the self and on intention, which is a word we've bandied about and not really explored that much here. Secondly, there are genre of self-writing, some of which actually Shula Shachar has translated into English, let alone Hermanus, the convert, or the so-called convert, and so on. And we're discovering, and there's quite a lot of also people who are now exploring it as historians who are exploring it. So if you're interested, I'd be so happy to send you sort of examples of all of that. But so they had a lot to work with. And he's very good at apportioning intention to the Jews, bad intention, really bad intention to the Jews and to detractors. So he's working in a world of goodies and baddies. How sophisticated it is, I doubt.
Thank you very much.